So hello, everyone. Welcome to those who are joining us on this in Providence muggy and in Narragansett kind of lovely and breezy Saturday. If you're looking for a June radio hour, you are in the right place. Thank you so much for being here. And just want to kind of introduce, in case you're not already aware, URI Master Gardener Program is part of University of Rhode Island's Cooperative Extension. Our mission is to educate citizens in environmentally sound horticultural practices through the dissemination of factual, research-based information. My name is Francesca Gallo. I'm the program associate with the Master Gardener Program. And if you've been to our radio hours before, today's going to work slightly differently. You'll already notice that the format's a little bit different. But we, as you know, through your registration forms, folks had the chance to contribute some questions in advance. So we have those questions lined up, and we invite you to enter your questions into the chat live, and we'll kind of do a back-end sorting and try to get as many questions answered as possible. If we don't get to your question that you submitted, don't worry, we will still get back to you with an answer on that. It just might take a couple of days as we hook up with our hotline folks. But basically, we'll be handing it off to Richard. Richard will kind of give a little bit of an update on what's going on with the other Master Gardener Ed services, because we know a lot of stuff has been on hold on COVID, and we're getting back going with the summer. And then we'll get right to those questions. So Richard, if you don't already know Richard, is a Master Gardener from our class of 2015, who specializes in container gardening, vegetable growing with an emphasis on pests, native plants, and permaculture. And a lot of the questions today are in that category, Richard, so you're going to be busy. Richard lives in Johnston and has a current focus on setting up an automated drip system for his vegetable garden. Which will eventually be Internet of Things connected, which I'm very curious to understand what that means. So maybe you can let us know that, Richard. But yeah, I'm going to hand it off to you, and I'll be kind of in the background helping to field questions and manage the chat. But take it away, my Master Gardeners.
Thanks, Francesca. So, as Francesca mentioned, I am involved with Master Gardeners. I'm on the council, responsible for some of the Ed services programs, including this one. And the virtual radio hour is just one of the many public educational services that we offer at the Master Gardeners, the URI Master Gardener Program. Before we get started, I just want to share some updates. Our Learn at Home webinar series continues virtually every other Tuesday. Our next webinar is on June 15th and will be about managing our forests to combine, to combat climate change. Our kiosks will be returning this summer. We're still ironing out a schedule, so keep your eye on the website. But if you're familiar with any of our reoccurring sites, we plan on getting back to as many of those as possible. So that would be a lot of farmers markets, especially. Soil testing. URI Master Gardeners are pleased to be offering contactless soil testing in each region of Rhode Island on a limited schedule. Sites include currently Slater Mill, Block Island Free Library, Roger Williams Botanical Center, Prescott Farm, and the URI Malin Center. Free soil, let's see, you can find soil testing drop-off sites and times on our website, and keep an eye on the site. We'll be adding soil testing to most of our kiosk events as well. The URI Master Gardener Gardening and Environmental Hotline is available 5 days a week to answer your questions by email and soon again by phone. And you're tuned into our radio hour. Our next one will be July 10th. We're going to bump it out a week for the July 4th holiday. I'd just like to invite anyone who has questions that haven't been registered to put them in the chat and address them to the panelists. We'll do our best to answer them this morning for you. And I'll be keeping an eye on that. And without further ado, I'd just like to introduce our other two panelists this morning. Very capable, very experienced Master Gardeners, Tom Hoagland and Roger Jadosz. I'm sorry, Roger. I'm not going to get your last name correctly. Jadosz? You're muted.
Jadosz.
Jadosz. My apologies.
That's okay.
So without further ado, let's get started. I see we have a bunch of attendees. I'm going to take a look at our questions. And we've got one here from Armanda, maybe Amanda, in Richmond, Rhode Island. How do I go about keeping my partial shade garden in bloom all season with perennials?
Well, you have to plant things that like partial shade. We put plants, vegetables, flowers, annuals, perennials where they like it. If a plant requires shade, then they're going to thrive in shade. If a plant requires 12 hours of sunlight like vegetables do, that's what they're going to need to produce a good crop. So you have to go with what the plant requires. We're not going to change Mother Nature. We have to adapt to what the plant needs and supply what the plant needs.
Thanks, Roger. Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was curious if the question was really about certain plants that will bloom later in the year. So shade gardens often will bloom. You can get a lot of things that will bloom before the above trees leaf out, but it's a little trickier finding plants that will bloom in July and August. But they're out there, and those lists exist. But if that was the question, then we need to come up with a list of some of the plants that they might be interested in. But Rogers is a good answer to.
Absolutely.
Things in there that can handle the shade, that's for sure.
Well, Richard, while we're on the topic of flowering annuals or perennials or plants that thrive in the shade, let's kind of go through a list of what would thrive in the shade. There's no point putting sunflowers in the shade. That's not going to work out. There are a number of flowering annuals and foliage annuals as well. Foxglove, impatiens, fuchsia, a flowering tobacco, a browalia, which I'm not too familiar with that. Tom, are you familiar with a browalia?
I usually see it in hanging baskets. It's
Oh,
usually
okay.
blue. Right.
Okay. There's lobelia. I mentioned impatiens, but particularly the New Guinea impatiens.
Yep.
Pansies, viola, begonias, twin spur. There's several different types of begonias. There's even a tuberous begonia that you can dig up in the fall and save the tubers over winter indoors. There's Joseph's coat is a foliage annual. Coleus. Coleus come in a variety of different colors. They're one of my favorite, and I do have Coleus growing in a very shaded north facing garden area on one of my gardens. Shamrock, Caladium, and bloodleaf is another one too. So there's quite a few plants that do well in shade.
I would also throw in that I keep a lot of ferns in my shady areas of the garden. And
A lot of Rhode Island natives will bloom in the shade too, including goldenrods and especially New England asters. I mean, they won't be as full as they would be in the sun, but they'll bloom and they'll grow tall.
Richard, you mentioned the fern. Were you able to enjoy the fiddleheads this spring?
Oh, Roger, I accidentally was poisoned by fiddleheads many years ago, and
No.
don't eat them anymore.
Okay.
So
was that a certain type? Because I understand that they're quite a nutritious snack.
I think it was the Pegasus. I had bought them at the farmer's market, to be perfectly frank.
Wow.
And whoever sold them to me did not tell me these need to be boiled.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yep.
I was young, didn't know, and I just put them up on the grill, threw some olive oil on them, and grilled them. And several people were not feeling well after that.
Good to know. Good tip.
That's how we learn, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that was very helpful. Thank you, guys. Let's jump over to to tomato plants. We have a couple questions from folks that are in the chat right now, or in the radio hour. So Sue Wynn from Providence asks, what's your favorite way to support indeterminate tomato plants? And your recommendation on spacing between plants in a small urban garden with raised beds?
Well, I could jump in here. I did a one of the master gardening videos on tomatoes last summer, the summer before last. No, I think it was last summer. So that's available on the website. But to answer the question specifically, I have bought 6-foot tomato cages from Gardener Supply, and I grow my tomatoes up, trying to make sure it's a single stalk going as high as 6 to 8 feet. And as to spacing, they should be at least 4 feet apart.
Thanks, Tom. How about you, Roger? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I kind of cheat, Tom. I kind of crowd my tomatoes a little bit more than that. But the risk I take is I minimize the airflow, which is going to promote blight, could promote fungal infection. So Tom's right, 4 feet is good, but I kind of cheat and go to 3 feet, maybe just a little bit less. I like to stake 6-foot stakes, put them in the ground, a foot or two, and as the indeterminate plant grows, I just loosely tie it up with a soft string. I did see a couple of years ago, a farmer had huge greenhouses, or actually huge hoop houses. I'm saying 15, even 18 feet high. And what he did, it was absolutely amazing. It was a hydroponic. And he had a tomato plant. It had to be 10 feet. And what he would do, as it was growing, he would loosely tie very soft, I can't recall if it was a soft string or even a fabric, around the main stem, and he would support it from above.
Right.
And to see it, it was really remarkable. The tomatoes, I can't recall what variety, but they were the size of grapefruits. Really, but again, it was a hydroponic. He was very careful as far as feeding the plants, the solutions. During the growth period, there was an emphasis on the nitrogen. During the bloom period, there was an emphasis on the phosphate, potassium. And it was really, really remarkable. It was right by Casey Farm in North Kingstown. He's no longer there, though, but it was a very, very good experience. At the URI Graduate Village community garden, I always enjoy going there because everybody from the different countries, they bring their own cultural practices. And there have been some very creative ways to stake or to support the tomatoes. This year, thanks to the generosity of the URI Master Garden Program, I was able to get a number of determinate tomatoes for them because they are somewhat limited as far as their ability to support a indeterminate tomato. So we did supply them with a number of determinates. So we'll see how that goes. It's always an adventure and it's always an experiment and fun.
So I think the key to all this is that to understand that you have to support tomatoes and you have to really prune out the multiple stems that they want to do. Otherwise, you end up with a mass of tomato vines spreading out over your garden and taking over and having it very difficult to find the fruit. So you can stake them up or cage them up or string them up, as Roger mentioned, but you definitely have to make sure that you get those tomatoes growing up in the air where they can get airflow and where they can get a lot of sunshine.
Richard, you've had experience with this as well. Could you comment on the removal of suckers?
Sure. Well, so one thing I was thinking of, Roger, in regard to what you said, is I also grow them 3 feet apart, and I cage them. I remove the suckers, which are generally the part growing out of the elbow. Um,
Good one.
But I also find that it's really very important to remove extraneous plant material like those suckers if you're growing in 3 feet places as opposed to 4, because that way what you're doing is making more airflow for the plant so that things like your mildew, your powdery mold, for instance,
Yep.
can't attack the plant as easily. That airflow, I have a very good amount of airflow in the backyard. So I find that I can get away with 3 feet per plant. But if you have a very still space, excuse me, that 4 feet per plant is a better recommendation in my opinion. And I use rounded tomato cages simply because a friend made them and gave them to me before he moved. So they're very sturdy and handmade.
Yeah, good.
Thanks. So I think we probably covered Sue Wynn's question about tomatoes. Moving right along, Diane in Smithfield asked us about potato plants. When should I put a covering over white potato plants to protect from pests? I planted in mid-April and the leaves are flourishing, but no flowers yet.
I grow potatoes. I've never felt the need to cover them. Where I am in Narragansett, I've never seen a Colorado potato beetle, which would be the main reason you'd want to cover them. And you would see damage on your plants if you did have a bug issue. So again, I don't generally cover them, and they won't flower probably until early July.
I too have never covered a potato plant. I just grow them just to see in buckets. I've never put them in the soil because I don't want them to run away. Learned my lesson with Jerusalem artichokes. But yeah, I've never covered them either. How about you, Roger?
Yes, I've grown potatoes in the ground and in containers. Never had an issue with Colorado potato beetle. Although now I have covered some brachius with some remay or a very light row cover for protection. But going back to the potato, I found that a lot of labor when you put the potatoes in the ground and you mound them and you hill them, and then when half the vine dies back, signed to harvest. And then I tried containers, and these were fabric containers. I believe they were 15-gallon size. They were good size, and I had a number, six or seven of them. And I put the potato eyes on the bottom, maybe on 4 inches of soil, and just lightly covered the eyes with soil. And as soon as the leaves and the vines started to grow, cover it up again with soil, and they'd start to grow again. Cover them up, complete the process until I got to the top of the container, which was several feet. And then the shiny leafy green vines and leaves, they would cascade over the top. I just let them grow and grow and inspect them now and then. Never had a bug problem with them. Very easy to water in a situation like that. And I got a kick out of it. And as Tom knows, Richard knows with his harvesting, you just knock over the container and the potatoes come rolling out. It was enjoyable, and I'm not growing potatoes this year. I'm taking a year off. Time to rotate. And tip about potatoes, I found out again through trial by error. Potatoes are one of the fewer vegetables that do prefer acidic soil. So you always want to test your soil for pH before planting to see what kind of changes have been made. But there are some vegetables that do prefer a little acidic, meaning 5.5. And some plants like it even up towards 7. But potatoes specifically do or can handle acidic soil 5 to 5.5.
Thanks, Roger. That's good information. Excuse me. Just a response to our question before about tomatoes. The person asking the question, Sue Wynn, says, I'm considering a Florida weave or staking them to a cattle panel behind it, neither of which I've done or heard of. I don't know if you guys have anything to add about that.
Well, if the panel is strong enough, it probably would work. But their tomatoes get very heavy, and when the vines get big, and a load of fruit is on there, so it has to be a sturdy panel. It's a possible thing, but you should probably, if you do that, probably treat it somewhat like you would espalier a tree. So you cut off the branches that are going back toward the panel and just have the branches go out to the side. That sounds like what you're trying to do. That might work.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom, that reminds me of the garden next to the Malin Center. Sandy Cook and one of the URI grad village residents constructed a metal arch.
Yeah, it's quite spectacular.
What is that? What material was that? What is that called?
You know, I don't remember what it is without seeing it, but I mean, they grow vines on that.
Yeah, that's
Not
pretty
tomatoes, but other vines.
impressive.
Thanks. So we have a question in the chat from David. What are some good sustainable roses for Rhode Island? I actually don't grow roses. Do you guys, have you got any experience with that?
I don't grow tea roses. I got over that early on in my gardening career because they're a hell of a lot of work. So I do climbers on trellises, and I do floribundas. You know, the bush type roses that will send off many flowers, but then pretty much are finished after one flush. So a lot of those are relatively easy care and knockouts, of which there's a tremendous amount, and they're almost indestructible. So you can grow a knockout almost anywhere. There's a lot of new roses now that are not prone to all the various diseases that the tea roses usually were. So I do have multiple roses, mostly climbers and floribundas.
I would refer the questionnaire to the hotline. We do have a number of very experienced rose experts, I would call them. In the spring and summer, they're out behind the Malin Center at that wonderful rose garden that we have and maintain. So I would direct the person to the rose experts on the hotline. I myself certainly am not. So I defer to somebody with more knowledge and experience.
Sounds good. So here's one that I think Sandra from Rentham asked, would you please define what a weed is, and should all weeds be removed? And I think we might get 3 different answers for this, but let's give it a go.
Love it. Okay.
You want to go first?
Sure. Weeds. Weed, I was taught somewhere, I forget what class it was or who mentioned it. A weed is a misplaced plant. That's all it is.
Yep.
Some people like them and some people don't. Some people consider a dandelion a weed. Some people consider it an edible delicacy. Some people make wine out of dandelions. So it's really in a person's individual preference. I, as a matter of fact, this past week was speaking with somebody who dropped off a soil test, and their specific question, they wanted to get rid of all the violas in their lawn. And I had said, well, I know people, if you dug them up, they'd buy them from you. So that was a good example where somebody wanted to know what herbicide he could use to get rid of his violas that are covering his lawn. And I know people that plant violas on purpose, just because they appreciate them. So it's that's my definition. It's a misplaced plant. If you don't like it, get rid of it. If you like it, fine.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That I would agree. The characterization is a weed is a plant that's showing up where you don't want it to be. But in many cases, well, I've evolved in my perennial garden more toward ground covers. And if you think about what weeds do, if they're not pulled, they act as a ground cover. So then if you want to not have a whole lot of weeds, mulching is one way to go. But another way to go is to pick out the ground coverish kinds of plants that you like that might flower more often and put them in your garden, and they will outcompete the weeds. But that's the definition. A weed is something that is growing where you don't want it to grow. And most of them are what we call garden thugs. They grow rapidly. They throw out a lot of seed when they flower. And if you don't get them when they're young or get them when they're few, you tend to have an infestation pretty quickly.
All very good information and advice, and I agree. The only thing I would actually add is that, Roger, your dandelion made me think,
Yes.
or as an example, you mentioned dandelion, and it made me think they can also be used for medicine,
Yep.
and they can be an indication of the state of your soil.
Yep.
Because dandelions like to send their taproot down very far. They grab nutrients from far deep below the soil, more so than the average plant. They grow very well in nitrogen-rich soil, but I know that they don't grow as well in either phosphorus or potassium, and I don't recall off the top of my head which.
I believe somewhere on our website under Garden Resource Library, we have a chart Richard alluded to that indicates what weed is good. The weed that you have indicates the soil that you have. Is that what it is?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. And also, I do have a book. It's not readily handy. It's out in the car. It's simply called Good Weed, Bad Weed. It's the sister book of Good Bug, Bad Bug. I can't recall the author. Easy to look up. Good Weed, Bad Weed. I always bring it to me to a kiosk. Put it on the table. People always enjoy going through it.
Yeah, and to that effect, I have a plant book that I really like for looking at weeds, which is called Invasive Plant Medicine, which tries to deal with things like kudzu, by trying to offer options with what to do with it rather than just trying to rip it all out. All right, so let's move on to, now I'm going to ask this, I suspect that we don't have an answer to this, but Sandra from Rentham also asked about plant ID apps and any suggestions on specifically reliable ones to use. Now, I'm going to just shoot in there or quickly enter in with, I've used about half a dozen over the last half a dozen years, and none of them are accurate enough for me. That having been said, I've probably haven't tried a new one in 6 months to 8 months. But I've found them to be as accurate as they are inaccurate, basically. With greater accuracy coming if you have actual shots of the fruit or of the flower of the plant.
Absolutely.
Do you guys have anything to add to that? Have you had any successes with those types of apps?
I don't have one, but the team I lead at the URI Botanical Garden, one of the ladies there has an app, and just to your point, I'd say it's accurate 65, 70% of the time. Otherwise, and sometimes I say, no, I'm sure that's not it. And she goes back and checks it again, and it comes up with a second. I'm still thinking that's not right. So the same plant, that app can drive 3 different answers. Just the way you take the shot. And to your point, I think flowers are probably the best indicator. So much foliage looks very similar to each other at different stages as well. So not a fan at this point.
The one I have, I'm looking at it now. It's National Geographic. It's by Naturalist. And I agree with the accuracy. It kind of brings me in. It brings me to the church. It just doesn't bring me to the right pew. So I get an idea. It's not. Yeah, I mean, it's a fun thing to do, and it makes you start thinking. But I agree with Tom. It's not 100% for sure.
Thanks, guys. So Marilyn in Bristol asks, I'm new at gardening and planted a blueberry plant and watered it. It dried up in the garden right away. Does that mean it will not flourish?
I would say from the description you have there that it dried up right away, the future of that plant may not be a good one. But I would go to if you're new at this, how you plant it. And there's a couple of tricks to do that, about digging the hole deep enough. When I plant a new plant, I dig the hole a little deeper than they say to, and then I loosen the soil at the bottom of the hole. And then I fill that hole with water and let it sit for a bit and soak in, and then do it again. And then when you pull the blueberry out of the pot, you need to either with your trowel or with your gloved hand, separate some of those roots, because if you buy a plant from a garden center, it may have been in that pot up to a year and there's a solid root ball. And the plant needs to be tough love. It needs to be encouraged to grow. So I generally will chop off the bottom part of that root ball, and then I will spread out the roots. Then I put it in the soil. And then you need to keep watering it until you get a good solid rainstorm. So it may have been a problem of not being planted properly, or it may not have gotten enough water, even though you watered it when you first put it in.
I think those are very good points. I think it's very important to look at the roots when you're transplanting a plant that you just purchased. Most frequently, unless it's a plant whose roots are extremely delicate or respond poorly to being touched, you really need to break up that root ball, as Tom mentioned.
I'd like to push the pH again. Blueberries are acid-loving plants. So if you put it in the ground and your pH is 6.5, it's not going to be happy. Blueberries can tolerate some pretty acidic soil, even below 5. But in that area, that's what they enjoy. The blueberries that we have down at East Farm, absolutely magnificent. I know there's a lot of work and care. I believe Rudy's Rangers are involved with that, but that's really that's where I would go to for expert advice. Some of the people down at East Farm.
But Roger, you wouldn't characterize a plant that doesn't have the right pH as dried up, right? It just would not be thriving, and it wouldn't be throwing a lot of berries. So
correct.
It did sound like a watering or a planting issue from the question.
Right. If the pH was poor, that plant would still survive. It would just be miserable.
Right. Miserable.
Yeah. Non-productive.
Right. Thanks, guys. So Marilyn from Bristol, who just asked about the blueberry plant, also asks, I planted some vegetables on May 18th, and I'm not seeing any growth. Specifically, carrots, squash, parsley, and chives. Do I need to be patient?
Carrots and squash the soil was probably too cold. I generally don't I just put my first planting of carrots in about 2 or 3 days ago. They like a certain temperature, warm soil. Squash, I won't even put in till mid-June. Yep. And oftentimes I'll wait till midsummer before I plant squash to avoid some of the bugs. Parsley, any herb takes a little while, though. Chives is usually pretty quick. So you should have seen some on those herbs. I'm not so sure about the carrots and the squash at this time. You may have to replant, or now we're going to get this heat spell, you might find that they come up now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all good points. Roger, did you want to add anything to that, or?
I wanted to know if she planted by seedlings or seed. That's certainly a difference there. The parsley that I started from seed, it's definitely lagging behind the small seedlings I have purchased, but the seedlings I have purchased that are in small pots, I've noticed the past couple of days, certainly the rain helped. And now, as Tom said, we're going to get this blast of warm air. I'm starting to see some action, some movement, some growth in the potted herbs I have, and also in the smaller gardens I have. The past day or two, I've really seen some growth. So I think be a little patient. I think we'll get some action this week.
Yeah,
I would also add for Maryland that I have volunteers from last year, both carrots, parsley, and chives, and they've all really shot up compared to the ones that got planted this year in the ground. So if you have things that have overwintered and survived, or volunteers from previous years, they may be hardier to start, but the plants that you put in the ground now or around now should catch up.
The temperature is tricky. I was thinking, I didn't mention that what's important is not so much the daytime temperature as the nighttime temperature. When the nighttime temperatures get above 50 consistently, that's when you see rapid growth in a lot of vegetables, because many vegetables that we eat are tropical. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, they're generally from a warmer climate, so they're waiting for those nights to be warm, and then they grow throughout. the 24-hour period. And that was, I forgot something else, but that's good.
Yeah, I mean, tomatoes are perennials in more tropical climates.
Right.
So Vivian, who a master gardener who's joining us here, is asking us, voles have destroyed my horizontal junipers. I'm getting an exterminator for the voles. What can I do about the junipers?
Get out your pruners.
Yeah.
I mean, they might be, but anything that you see is that's brown and straggly, like it's lost its needles, those branches will not come back. So you need to get tough and cut all those branches that look terrible, because junipers, they'll not come back on their own. And then if you cut it back hard enough and the voles are gone, you should get new growth. But in the meantime, it's certainly not going to look as nice as you wanted it to. So you face the question of either replacing him or cutting them and then being patient for them to be restored into their full glory.
Tom, would it help at all, since they are struggling, to give them a little push? I'm not sure if fertilizer would be recommended. What do you think?
I've never fertilized any evergreens, but it's possible. But it sounds like the voles have damaged the branches, and as a result, they've probably died back. And you see that in these ground junipers a lot of times. You see a lot of dead branches that no one has pruned out. So it could be voles, or it could be, drought, or just the things get old. But you see a lot of these examples of this ground juniper that look bad after a while, because so many branches have died. And when they lose their needles, you just have the sticks. Not a good look.
Yeah, I had a bunch of gypsy moth issues that year, where the gypsy moths were not knocked back by the bacterias because of the drought. And I had several evergreens that were eaten by them. It's taken until this year for them to start to grow back in those places.
Wow.
So that's 3 years ago. So you might need some time, really, for them to accept that they've lost that and to start to regrow that area. She is chatting with us, though, and asks, what can I replace them with? She's concerned about weeds growing in where they are, and they're in a retaining wall that holds the soil.
Well, again, if you don't want to cut them back and wait for them to restore on their own, the option is to replace the plants.
Any suggestions with what you might replace them with?
I guess I was assuming that she liked the junipers. So, yeah, you'd have to, almost anything that does that, it leaves room for weeds to grow. The junipers are nice and dense. I think that's why they're used so often. But cottony aster is used in a similar situation. Ground covers. I mean, a lot of perennial ground covers that aren't bushes would do the trick too.
Thanks, Tom. So we're asking about some general advice regarding rodent pest management. The best thing that I can offer is, if you have a cat, brush them and stick the hair in the holes.
For groundhogs, you're talking about, right?
Groundhogs, voles, mice, anything that's not going to like the smell of a predator around them.
But you've been able to determine where the holes for the mice and the voles are? They're pretty small.
They are pretty small. I've seen on my property, I've stuffed hair in vole holes for sure. Maybe a rat, hard to say. Haven't seen exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But it's a hole about yay big.
Yeah, that's pretty big for a vole.
Right.
But I agree with your cat situation. If you don't have the cat hair, used cat litter also works. They don't like the smell of ammonia. This is a particularly groundhog. So in my early days, I tried the smoke treatment and closing up the holes. None of that worked. But I found recently that just a couple of dollops of used cat litter in the hole, groundhogs take off and go elsewhere. But you could probably replicate that with just taking a cloth, soaking in some kind of ammonia cleaning solution, and putting it in the beginning of the hole too. And remember, groundhogs always have 2 holes, so you got to search for the escape hatch too.
Great, thanks, Tom. Yeah, and I'd also add that I have a couple of live traps, but ideally you get them, you stuff their holes with ammonia and they find somewhere else to live rather than you having to trap them and illegally moving them,
Yes.
which I'll remind everybody that if you trap an animal, it is technically illegal to move it.
Yep.
I don't know anybody that's been pulled over and ticketed for that, but it's not really terribly pleasant to have a live animal in your car anyway, because they're pretty upset about being trapped. So I think the best thing is to start with deterrent, and if you can't get it that way or get rid of it that way, maybe move up. I, like you, Tom, I have some of those smoke bombs, the sulfur bombs. I just couldn't bring myself to use it on the groundhog.
Well, yeah, you just have to make their environment uncomfortable. They're there because they have a food source and it's a nice place to live. So if you make it uncomfortable for them with the cat litter, with the cat hair, with any wire fencing that you stuff down there, coyote urine, a pet, a dog, what makes their environment uncomfortable, and they'll move out.
Yep.
And it's a good time to buy and sell, so they'll find another location.
Just don't tell your neighbors that you evicted them from your own property.
That's right. They'll go next door.
Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to take us to the next question here. We've got Sue in Narragansett. It says, I have a large, beautiful holly in my yard. The bottom section is brown and looks dead. What's causing this? It's the second year it's been bad, and I don't want it to die.
Well, I would take a clue from the question that at being large, that I would assuming that the tops and the middle of the plant look good. So the logical answer is that the bottom parts of the plant are being shaded by the upper parts of the plant. And what happens with the plant is that, if a certain branch or leaves are not really functioning as the food supplier to the plant will die them off. So as long as it doesn't seem to be spreading up into the middle and high parts of your holly, I think the plant sounds like it's okay. And I would just take out my pruners and prune out all the dead stuff on the bottom. I mean, to think about holly trees in the wild, they don't have a lot of stuff on the bottom. They grow tall, and any evergreen, sooner or later, the lower branches die and fall off or are broken off. But it sounds to me like it might be just a light issue, unless you see damage on the upper and middle parts of the plant.
Yeah, if you're seeing new growth on the upper and middle parts of the plant, I would say the plant's probably in good shape. To Tom's point, I've seen plenty of older hollies where you can see that they've lost branches and leaves over time on the base as they grow bigger.
It's just a normal process. It's a normal process.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
One thing I'd check, because I did lose a holly. I had 3 hollies at the other house, maybe 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, kind of ball shaped. And one of them, the leaves on the bottom were dropping. They were turning brown and dropping. And what I had noticed one time by accident, I kind of bumped into it, and I saw this. I thought it was white powder. And come to find out, I had I believe it was either a mite or an aphid infection. That I lost the whole plant.
Wow.
It took a while, so I don't know if it was the cause or not. But then that kind of taught me to really inspect. Just as you do, you walk around your property, you inspect things, you check things out, and that's what one of the master gardeners taught me. Always look under the leaves as well. Because a lot of insects or predators will lay their eggs under the leaf, which I did not know. So I'm definitely in the habit of inspecting the entire plant. Again, it could be environmental, it could be a shade issue, but I did lose one to insects.
So how rapidly did that plant that you cite as an example, how rapidly did it progress from that lower level up into the rest of the plant?
I
So
would
maybe,
say a
oh, sorry.
couple of weeks. It was kind of quick.
So it was fast, yeah.
Meaning, yeah, I'd say 2 weeks. It's been a while, but yeah, that's my guess. I'd say a couple of weeks.
And that would be that would support the point. So if you've seen this brown damage or dead branches and it's been going on over the last several gardening seasons, it's probably a light or an environmental issue. And but if you see something moving rapidly through a plant, it's probably insect or disease.
Good point. There's my takeaway, Tom. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So let's see. I have a question from Sue Win, who asked us a couple questions prior. I'm going to try and share my screen here and see if you can see the pictures that I brought up. There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
She's asking about leaf damage, these leaves, and these tomato leaves.
Ooh.
Fungus.
Yeah, the tomatoes are fungus. Do you think is that a hosta? I think that's a hosta leaf.
That's a hosta, yep.
You think that's a fungus too, Roger?
No, it kind of looks burnt.
That's what I thought. It looks like sun scale to me.
Yeah. I'd like to.
Go ahead, Roger.
I was just going to say a picture's great, but I'd really like to see it, touch it, feel it. You get a lot more from just the 2D picture.
So, well, on the hosta, if it looks like it's getting a whole lot more sun. So a first question would be, did something change in that hosta's environment? Did some branches come down or were they cut down so the hosta might have been in partial or full shade and now it's getting a lot of midday sun? That would be a first guess on something like that. The tomato is definitely fungus.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see if she answers your question about something changing in our chat. In the meantime,
maybe for the tomato, there's a variety of fungicides. Copper comes to mind. I don't know, would spinosad be appropriate for that, Tom, or neem oil? I know.
Usually that's for bugs. For fungus,
yeah.
I've used the copper spray mostly.
Yeah, copper. Yeah.
And it's just a mitigator. It doesn't really stop it. I mean, it just slows it down. Once the fungus is in the soil and on the plant, once the fungus is on the plant, you might have got from some of my other answers is that once you see damage like this, you remove it as fast as possible and don't add that to the compost pile. Bag it and throw it away because the fungus it spreads very easily. And the copper spray, if you're diligent about it, usually you have to start spraying in late June, and that's just to keep enough foliage on the plant to supply food for the tomatoes because the fungus goes rapidly.
And rotate the crop. You don't want to plant tomatoes in the same spot because the spores from the fungus, they'll end up in the soil, they'll overwinter.
Yep.
And they're there. So that's where we rotate, particularly tomatoes.
And potatoes, because they're the same family. Yeah. So you can't grow your tomatoes where the potatoes were either.
Yep. That's true.
That's good info. Thanks, guys. Sue Win, who has those hostas and tomatoes, says there is more sun now on the hostas. Some grapevines were removed, so they're in more sun.
That's it.
Yep.
So the good news is that hostas will thrive in the sun. So I mean, what you're looking at is a short-term effect. So those leaves will probably die and fall off, but hostas can handle sun. It's just that I assume that the grapevines were taken off in the very recent past. So those leaves had already formed in one type of environment. Bang! You took away the grapevines. Now those leaves, which evolved or were grown to handle a certain level of light, are now facing this huge amount of light and they're reacting. But new leaves will come on the hosta. It won't. It can handle sun.
Thanks, guys. All right, well, we're getting short on time, so I'm just going to try and prioritize any questions for folks who are in here now. Let's see. Faye in Charleston says, I have yellow leaves and black spots on my roses. What is causing this?
Pass.
It's a fungus.
Yeah.
I don't, like I said, usually the roses I grow don't have this issue, which is why I grow them. So if it's a tea rose or a more delicate, then I think there's a whole range of various sprays that people use to keep these funguses at bay. And I think that's a hotline question because I'm not sure what you should do in that case.
Yeah, I agree. Faye, if you're listening, I see you're on here. I would definitely reach out to the hotline. And I saw that Francesca had posted the email address for that. Looks like she'll send that on to the hotline for you. Thanks, Francesca. Shirley in Bellingham asks, how do I tell the difference between ladybug eggs and aphid eggs? That's a great question because I can't say that I've ever seen either egg. Aphids are so small, I'm not sure I would be able to identify an aphid egg. How about you
You
guys?
usually see the mature pupa stage, the one that's crawling along and eating everything. I wouldn't be able to do that either. I wouldn't know one egg from another.
Same here.
But like Roger says before, they're probably on the bottom of your leaves or along the bottom of the stalk.
Absolutely.
Remove them all.
Yeah, any eggs on your plants are bad eggs.
Yeah, pretty much.
The ladybugs, they'll be okay. They'll thrive regardless. Either of you have any experience with Japanese beetles?
Well, we have that nice chart at the on the hotline at the Malin Center that describes its life cycle. I believe they're coming up now, eating the roots. Maybe a little early for that, but the skunks will find them in your yard, that's for sure.
I've seen the white caterpillars were not well. Would you get that? They're kind of like caterpillar, more like slugs in the ground when I turn over the soil. So they're in there, but we don't have a major problem down here. To try to get them out of the lawn, I think milky spore is used to cut back on the numbers in the soil. But everything I've read about having them once they're born and flying about is that the traps tend to attract even more Japanese beetles to your property. So unless it's a terrible infestation, which I haven't had, I tend to say, okay, shoo, go away, and let whoever eats Japanese beetles, which I think birds eat them, but not a major problem at this point.
Yeah, same. Thanks. So Joe in Mass asked, what's the best way to prevent fungus on tomato plants? And we kind of already covered this. I would say the best way to prevent it is to make sure there's enough air flowing through so that no air becomes stale around the plants. That is how fungus tends to quickly grow on those. But if you guys have anything else to add to that, I would love to hear. Just remove
the when you see it show up on a lower branch, remove that branch. Even if you've got good leaves on it, if all it takes is a few spores to spread to the next branch above it and the next branch above that. So be ruthless about pruning out any damaged branches. And
frequent inspection.
Yep. And then if the copper sulfate sprays will work, but you got to make sure you spray the underside of the leaves and the top side of the leaves. It's painful.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
You really want to get a sprayer where you can rotate the nozzle so that it rotates upward, because most funguses live on the bottom of leaves and then actually display the problem. The plant displays the problem on the top of the leaf. So if you just spray the top, it looks like you're attacking the fungus, but the reality is that the
Correct.
fungal webbing underneath the leaf is not getting dealt with. So let's move a little bit in a different direction. And we're closing in on 11 o'clock, but I think this is a great question. What advice do you have on native vegetation to plant near a gravelly corner of your house, which floods regularly? The person asking the question says, we have a stand of yews and a cherry tree, which have been overcome by standing water in the last few years.
Sounds like the perfect location for a rain garden, which you can read about and reference on the internet, or there are plenty of books out that talk about it. And rain gardens are generally characterized by plants that can handle that level of inundation, periodic. A lot of natives, Joe Pye weed, a lot of the, I think it's Heliopsis, a lot of those kinds of plants can handle that amount of water. Shrub-wise, willows, sometimes the dogwoods, blueberries, things like that can handle more water. But inundation, that's tough on almost everything except perennials. Not woody plants, in other words. Woody plants are tougher.
Richard, where's the caller from? What town?
The request is from Narragansett.
Oh, good. Okay, so I would suggest take a ride down to Wilcox Park in Westerly. They have a wonderful rain garden down there. Corliss Merkel, she's the master gardener that's down there a lot. And now that things are loosening up, there's a lot of activity down there. So I would suggest this person from Narragansett to take a ride down there on a Saturday, and there'll definitely be some master gardeners there and other people that take care of Wilcox Park. It's very nice.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'm not sure if you're on the line, but I hope you were you heard that. So we've answered most of our questions here. Let's see, one more. I have a dappled willow shrub I'd like to train into a small tree. How and when to prune?
Well, the easy rule on pruning is prune it after it blooms. Now the willow, the dappled willow, which sounds like the flamingo willow with the white and pink foliage on it. Once that starts to fade, then you can prune it. I mean, you can prune it anytime, but it's better to wait until after the glory of the plant is taking place, be it flowers or foliage. But I have it can be done, but you shouldn't do it all at once. What's the general rule? I think it's 20 to 30% of a plant's leafing area can be cut in a given year. So pruning is a kind of a multi-year endeavor if you're trying to shape it into as you said, a single standard, making it into a small tree. I've seen that done with the flamingo willow. It makes a spectacular display.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Well, it's 11:01, and for the sake of our panelists and our guests, I'd like to try and keep close to the time. So I'm going to say, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here, to all our attendees, and to Roger and Tom. Just like to again remind everybody that next month's radio hour will be July 10th, the second Saturday. Registration's already available. If you have any feedback or suggestions, we have a survey available as well. And I believe that'll get posted in the chat, or has been posted in the chat right there. Thank you, Francesca. Please invite your friends to register and follow our Cooperative Extension on Facebook and other areas, other social media. And thank you so much for attending and participating. And thank you again, Roger and Tom.
Thanks, Richard. Tom.
This went great.
All right.
Okay.
See ya.
Take care, everybody. See you next month.